Good evening. I'm Jill Kerr-Conway, Vice President of the Board of the John F. Kennedy Library Foundation. And on behalf of the Foundation, my Foundation colleagues, and the Library Director, Tom Putnam, I'd like to thank you all for coming this evening to join in our celebration of the 50th anniversary of President Kennedy's inauguration. I'd like also to express particular thanks to the friends and institutions that make these forums possible. Bank of America, the lead sponsor of the Kennedy Library Forum series, Boston Capital, the Lowell Institute, Raytheon, and the Boston Foundation, along with our media sponsors, the Boston Globe, WBUR, and NECN. This forum will be broadcast on WBUR and WGBH Forum Network. Today is a special day for us in this institution. 50 years ago, John F. Kennedy was inaugurated as the 35th President of the United States. There are many events in Boston, Cambridge, and Washington commemorating this anniversary today, and I'm proud to represent the Kennedy Library in introducing our celebration of this historic day. What better person to discuss and describe for us the shape and influence of the decade of the 1960s, as well as our culture today, than the veteran broadcast journalist, Tom Brokaw. And he will be helping us all understand JFK's influence on all those areas of our world. Mr. Brokaw was the anchor, the managing editor of NBC Nightly News with Tom Brokaw, and from 1983 until his retirement in December 2004. He covered every major story of the 1960s and has been on the scene ever since, bringing us the most important news stories of our generation. Today, he is special correspondent for NBC News, producing long-form documentaries and providing expertise during the election coverage and breaking news events. He has received far too many awards to list them all, but some include the Edward R. Murrow Lifetime Achievement Award, the Emmy Award for Lifetime Achievement, a dozen Emmys, 2 DuPonts, and Peabodys. He was inducted as a fellow into the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and the U.S. Army has honored him with their highest award, the George Catlett Marshall Medal, first ever to a journalist. We're also very happy, indeed, to have Jane Pauley as our moderator this evening. Jane Pauley was the co-host of the Today Show from 1976 to 1989, which catapulted to first place among the morning shows under her reign. Her first partner sharing the Today desk, by the way, was Tom Brokaw. After resigning from the Today Show, she began a successful NBC weekly magazine series, Real Life with Jane Pauley, later renamed Dateline, and was its host for over a decade. In 2004, she had her own daytime program, The Jane Pauley Show. She also substituted for Tom Brokaw on the NBC Nightly News. Currently, she's the host of Your Life Calling, a joint project with NBC and the AARP, featuring stories about older Americans reinventing themselves. She's been recognized with an Emmy and an American Woman in Radio and Television Award. Her memoir, Skywriting, A Life Out of the Blue, was the New York Times bestseller and is on sale in our museum store along with Mr. Brokaw's books. One piece of housekeeping: due to the impending snowstorm, Mr. Brokaw has to catch a plane this evening. We will be taking written questions from the audience from 6:15 to 6:30, and then we'll conclude at that time and ask that you all in the audience remain in your seats while Mr. Brokaw is escorted to his car. Please join me in welcoming to the stage our 2 wonderful guests, Tom Brokaw and Jane Pauley.
Back together again.
Jill, thank you so much. It is such an honor to be with you on this auspicious occasion. The little girl I used to be can't quite believe I'm included, nor can I quite believe that Tom Brokaw's little sister, who is me, is here to talk about such important events. Tom and I are dear, dear old friends. Tom remembers everything. My memoir could have been called I Remember Nothing, but Nora Ephron thought of it first. Tom not only remembers everything, he was always paying attention. So he is the appropriate person to be here. Tom, you are a great citizen. You are a great journalist. You are a sage and a historian. So I think we should endeavor to interweave all of those threads into this conversation, and in asking a question or raising a topic, we may hear from the citizen, the sage, the historian, or the journalist. We will find out. First of all, were you of voting age in the 1960 election cycle?
Actually, I was not yet, because in those days you had to be 21, and I was 20. And I remember feeling denied in a way. I debated on behalf of 18-year-olds getting the vote when I was in high school and doing what you did at Boys State and Girls State. I was a political junkie, and I was very interested in that campaign because what President Kennedy represented to my generation was what I thought was a fresh beginning. That it was, when I look back on it now, I think it was the invention of modern America, that campaign. Because, as he said, the torch was passed to a new generation. It was a generation that came out of the war and came back determined to take charge of this country and shape it in a way that reflected their own experiences. And then you had the youthful dynamism of not only the candidate, but his family and all of his friends as well. And if you lived where I did, in the working class communities out in the Great Plains of America, that was something to behold. We seldom had seen that kind of glamour and romantic figures who would go sailing and skiing. These were all alien sports to us in those days where we lived. Now the world has changed. A lot of people who do that kind of thing, but the Kennedys burst on the screen full-blown. I was first aware of them when Bobby was a counsel to the Labor Racketeering Committee, and I would hear that distinctive New England clatter and chatter of his patois and think, wow, where did that come from? You know, we talked like Fargo, the movie, where I lived. This is a whole lot of, this did get my attention.
You talk like all the anchors, because all the anchors come from the Midwest, like me. You were not an ordinary boy. You did not have an ordinary childhood growing up on the plains, and you've made the point that family was very different from yours, and yet in notes you gave me, you said that the Kennedys were the family you wished would adopt you.
Right. I did. I have a confession to make. 1960 was a very exciting and important milestone for America. It was one of the worst years of my life. I had come out of high school, as Jane knows the story, as a whiz kid, great expectations from everyone, and I went seriously off the rails the first 2 years of college. And by the fall of 1960, I had actually dropped out of college, and I guess I was trying to find my way. The professor who encouraged me to do that was a legendary political science chair at the University of South Dakota who had turned out governors and Rhodes Scholars and senators and federal judges, and I was supposed to be his next best prospect. And he said, I think you better go out and get all the wine, women, and song out of your system and then come back here when you can do us some good. It did give me the opportunity, because I had a lot of time on my hands, to watch this campaign in a way. It was a life-changing experience for me, and I'll jump to the conclusion of that. On election night, you'll remember how long that election night went on, until 8 o'clock in the morning. I sat at my parents' home. I was kind of in between jobs at the time, trying to think what I was going to do, and watched all night long the coverage. By then, I was already working at a television station, part-time as a newsman and doing announcing duties, and I had been a writer for the newspapers around the area. And I watched this from 8 o'clock at night, Central Time, until 8 o'clock in the morning. And at the end of that 12-hour period, I thought, that's what I want to do with my life. I want to be a political correspondent. And I had already figured out I may get to cover Teddy as the president, because I thought there would be a kind of line of succession that first John Kennedy would be elected, and then probably Bobby, or Bobby would manage Teddy's campaign. I can get there when Teddy is the president of the United States. And it did get me back on track. I was back in school the next semester. I had repaired my academic record, and as Jane knows, I, more importantly, repaired my relationship with my wife, Meredith, who had written me off and sent me on my way. And one of her few lapses of judgment, she decided to take me back. But, and I must say that so the beginning of the Kennedy administration was the beginning for me of my own new life as well.
Tom is well known at NBC over the years as Duncan the Wonder Horse, because he could work from 8 o'clock at night and 8 in the morning. And I didn't know that you had already had some practice at that.
That's right.
as a younger man. Senator Humphrey carried South Dakota in the primary, and Nixon carried South Dakota in the general election. Why so cold?
Well, it's South Dakota is an odd state politically. It switches back and forth from populist Democrats. John Kennedy's very good friend, George McGovern, was a South Dakotan, was the senator from there. And he lost that election. He became the director of Food for Peace, but later was elected senator. It's settled by a lot of Eastern Europeans and Central Europeans, Germans and Norwegians, who came over with socialist inclinations, but they live in scattered rural communities. They're very conservative. They're very self-reliant. And I must say, they're very Protestant for the most part, and they were very skeptical of the Catholicism of John Kennedy, and also the wealth. There was great, I think, suspicion about electing A, somebody as young, B, somebody who is Catholic, and C, somebody who is so rich. How can he know about us? I was one of the few kind of outriders in our area going around saying, oh my God, this is the most exciting thing I've ever seen, the idea that we could have somebody like John Kennedy as president. My family, because of their experiences in the Depression, which had been really very, very trying for them. They lost, my mother's family lost the farm, and there was very little hope. My dad came from extremely difficult circumstances. They were lifelong Democrats. They worshipped at the feet of FDR. So there was no question in their minds. They were not going to vote for Nixon. I remember Mother saying to me, and she was a keen student of American politics, I don't know, this very young man and that family, the way she suggested it, seems to have a sense of entitlement, and that troubled her. But she voted for Kennedy, and then, of course, like so many others, she was quickly enraptured by what was going on in Washington.
My parents never knowingly voted for a Democrat in their lives. My father inadvertently got me my first job out of college working for the Democrats, but that's another story. Considering the state of the economy at the time of that election, unemployment in the last year of the Eisenhower presidency was 7%.
It was very high.
The gross domestic product, the growth in the last year of his presidency was 1%. It does make you wonder why it was so hard for a Democrat to win presidency under those economic circumstances.
Well, you know, it's reflective and reminds me of the situation that another young president in the not too distant past inherited. President Obama didn't have the Cold War. This president did, John Kennedy. And the Cold War at that point was at swords point. Castro had taken over Cuba not long before that, and there were great alarms about what they meant. And Khrushchev was this very canny very roguish peasant with a keen intellect, and we couldn't quite tell what he had in mind. And then the domestic economy was flat and it was on a very uncertain path. Then there was something else that was going on that was quite remarkable that turned out to be one of the great transformative events of our lifetime, of American history. There was a young African American, or as we called him in those days, Negro president in the South, who was beginning to create a movement based on the nonviolent tenets of Mahatma Gandhi. And he was one of the most eloquent citizens that any of us had ever heard. And he had a great moral cause that he was pursuing. And there was already the manifestations of the violence that later came to define that. Moreover, there was something else that was unique. This was playing out on television for the first time. All of us. The campaign, the Cold War, what was going on in the economy, John Kennedy being inaugurated on television. And so all of America was knit together in a way that it had not been before. Wherever you lived in America, the most remote reaches, you could see what was going on in the South. You could see the excitement and the energy that the new president brought to Washington, D.C. You could hear about what was going on with the strike in the steel industry, for example, and what was happening there. So citizenry took on a new form. People were much closer to the issues and the problems of the day than they had ever been. And that, too, I think, was the beginning of the modern age in which we're now living.
As you introduced the civil rights and Dr. Martin Luther King on the way over here, I mentioned to Tom that having no brothers and a cousin who was 4F and no boyfriend, Vietnam was not the formative issue for me. The civil rights was my living room war, and that probably was the formative for me. But in the early 60s, there seems to have been there was a paradox of President Kennedy wanted to address the issue of civil rights, but legislatively did not want to, it couldn't surrender the reality that to be aggressive in civil rights might threaten a political agenda. He was right about that, but was he right?
Well, what I thought about both John Kennedy and Robert Kennedy is that is an area in which you saw enormous growth, and what you saw was the raised consciousness that they had about what was going on in the South. Most people in this country who were not people of color, deliberately or otherwise, were oblivious to the indignities and the violations of the fundamental rights of black citizens. I mean, I grew up in the industrial north, or in the agricultural north, and then in the industrial north. I worked in Omaha, for example, my first job. Omaha has a very significant black population. A lot of people are not aware of that. It had a big race riot in 1964 or 65 later. There were no Negro clerks downtown in any of the department stores or at the bank or any place where you did business in the center of the city, or certainly in the suburbs where we lived. They were confined to their neighborhoods. I had a friend who was a black Parks and Recreation director for the city of Omaha, and we'd gotten to be pals, and I always had this great curiosity about race and the effect on people, and I wanted to talk to him about what the community was like. And he said, you wouldn't be comfortable going to one of my places, I wouldn't be comfortable going to one of your places, let's ride around. So we did one night in Omaha. And he said, what we don't understand here is why the local television station spends so much time on what's going on in the South when we have the same thing going on in our community. Mm-hmm. And that to me was a revelation, but I couldn't move my station. I went in and argued with my boss about covering more about what was going on. And then I moved to the South. President Kennedy had so many issues on his agenda, obviously, and also the most powerful members of his party in the Congress were Southern Democrats. Mm-hmm. And so the Kennedys were nothing if not pragmatic when they looked at an issue politically. And they were slow to ramp up. They had Harris Woolford and other people pushing them harder. Arthur Schlesinger. And finally, the moral weight of what was going on and the outrageous behavior of the Southern governors and the police and the state authorities pushed them over the edge. John Kennedy's call to Coretta King when Dr. King was in the Birmingham jail had a big impact on the campaign. Andrew Young once told me, you know, Kennedys, we didn't know from the Kennedys. We knew about Nelson Rockefeller. He was our friend. Nelson Rockefeller had been a great patron to the civil rights movement early on. When I was living in Atlanta in 1965, he came down and gave a new organ to the Ebenezer Baptist Church. And for Dr. King and for Andrew Young and for a lot of those lieutenants, their big hero in the North from a dynastic family was Nelson Rockefeller. They were skeptical about the Kennedys. But then the Kennedy administration put the full force of law and the American military behind the enforcement of the admission of James Meredith and Nick Katzenbach, who I think was one of the great heroes of the time, who was in Bobby Kennedy's Justice Department, stood in the schoolhouse door and confronted George Wallace, and the marshals were mobilized in Mississippi, and the president was forced to call out the 101st Airborne to make sure that a citizen of Mississippi who'd been an Air Force veteran could enroll in that school. So it was a very vibrant and volatile time, and both the president and his attorney general, I know, based on conversations with people close to him at the time and what historians have been able to learn, were nervous about the political impact of it on their other agenda. But finally they got it, and then I knew no greater champion later of civil rights than Bobby. That is, of all the national politicians I've covered, I've never seen as much growth in one of them as I did in Bobby Kennedy from the time of his brother's assassination to when he was murdered in 1968 and running.
Well, I'm from Indianapolis, and I was in Indianapolis when Dr. King was assassinated, and Bobby gave one of the most important speeches of the 20th century extemporaneously. And speaking of great speeches, ask not. I'd like to just read a section from that speech and just let it hang in the ether of the 21st century. The new frontier I speak of is not a set of promises. It is a set of challenges. It sums up not what I intend to offer the American people, but what I intend to ask of them. Can you imagine an American politician saying, I'm not offering you something, I'm asking you?
Right. And I have actually said to others that I always thought that was an important part of the president. Obviously, those words will ring in the minds of not only this generation, but history. Ask not what your country can do for you. Wherever John Kennedy appeared during his campaigns, he would invoke that sentiment and that charge. And I actually, in a casual conversation with the president that we now have, I reminded him that wherever President Kennedy went, as a campaigner and as a president, he said, in effect, I need your help. I can't do this on my own. Ask not is another way of stating that. And we've lost that in American life. Now, I have been using it recently in lectures and in moderating debates. When I went out to California in the fall to moderate the final Jerry Brown-Meg Whitman debate, they'd been through a lot of the issues, so I opened the debate by reminding them it was the 50th anniversary of the inauguration of John Kennedy, ask not, and I said, look into the camera and say to the citizens of California, ask them what they should be doing on behalf of their state, not what the state can do for them. And the two candidates were flummoxed because they had not been thinking in that fashion. And we need to reignite, it seems to me, that spirit. People are willing to be called to a higher station, and they're, I think, having gone through what we just did, that they're waiting to be called to that, but no one has been able to do it quite as well as John Kennedy did.
You describe the inaugural festivities, as your word, electrifying, and understandably, but how quickly the speeches and the glamour and collides with the reality of the very events that get in the way of a president's agenda. Khrushchev, Bay of Pigs. Which do you want? Do you want to talk about the summit in Vienna, being bullied by Khrushchev?
Yeah, that's fascinating, because by the time I got to Washington, there were a number of senior correspondents who had been on that trip, and they were still talking about it. President Kennedy, at the top of his agenda, what are we going to do about the Cold War? What are we going to do about the Russians? Here we have two nuclear powers with missiles pointed at each other, Castro taking power just off our shores. This is a huge, huge issue for not just for the administration, but for the country and for mankind, for that matter. So the 43-year-old president, a war hero, a product of Boston politics, with a very strong family tradition of politics and can-do, take charge, goes to Vienna, and Khrushchev verbally beats him up for 2 days, just batters him around, and it has a huge effect on the president. He's furious with himself for not standing up to him and not being prepared for this. I later heard from other correspondents who were on the trip that the president came out to get on Air Force One, and one of the correspondents, Bill Lawrence, later of ABC News, took him off to the side. He was supposed to be representing all the reporters, but he kept his piece for himself. He said, "How did it go?" And the president looked at him and said, "It was brutal." And Lawrence should have shared that with the rest of the White House press, but he didn't. I kind of understand why. That's a pretty good quote. Scotty Rustin, a lot of you will remember him. He had a private session with him, and the president just sat down. He was exasperated and furious with himself. And a lot of people trace the Soviet missiles going into Cuba trace it back to that meeting that Khrushchev took the measure of him and said, "This guy won't stand. I can go do what I want to do." And it was kind of welcome to the NFL, Mr. President. This is what we're dealing with.
But by the same token, the Cuban Missile Crisis, it was probably on President Kennedy's mind as well. Here is my chance.
Mm-hmm. It was not just that, but it was also Berlin. Khrushchev, people forget this. Khrushchev said, "We're taking Berlin back. You're not going to have access to West Berlin through the Western corridors." And that was another kind of volatile flashpoint moment. And Kennedy said, "This won't stand," and they sent General Clay over there, and they got him, with this convoy on the road. Lyndon Johnson was in and out of there as well. It's a very good book by Richard Reeves about the Berlin airlift that went on earlier, but then he deals with what happened during the Kennedy years. So we were at flashpoint in a number of areas around the world, and it was beginning to bubble up at that time in Southeast Asia, in Laos, and because no one understood what China was up to, and everyone was terrified about what the Soviet Union was up to. They'd already launched Sputnik at that point. I suppose what you would call the vacancy of their economic system was not yet as apparent as it later became during the years when Gorbachev was forced to give up on it. So it was a difficult time. I mean, we weren't quite diving under our desks then. That had happened earlier in the 50s, but everybody was aware about what would happen in case we had a nuclear attack. We had missiles all over the western United States, including my home state of South Dakota. Strategic Air Command. I was working in Omaha. That was where the bombers were on what they called looking glass missions. They were flying 24/7, so they could be in the air in case something happened, and they could launch the counter-strike. Dr. Strangelove.
I was completely convinced that the Indianapolis 500 2.5-mile oval was a bullseye target.
Yeah. Well, you Indianans would think that.
Yeah. After the Cuban Missile Crisis, President Kennedy's approval rating went up a lot. It went up to 77%. But what surprises me is that it had been 66% before it went up.
it, his father, as I remember, Joe Kennedy said to him, "Go tell the truth," and he did. He acknowledged what was going on after the Bay of Pigs and after the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the country began to have new faith in him and his ability to stand up to these problems. We're seeing that again in this country. President Obama's ratings have just gone up, in large part, because of his demeanor during Tucson and the speech that he made that night, and also his demonstrable willingness to reach across party lines on some of the vexing taxing issues that we have in economics in this country. The country, I've been doing this a long time, and the country is not as deeply divided as what I call the political pros would have you believe on the left and the right. Most of the countries out there, just like the rest of us, trying to make things work every day. And they understand that to do that, you kind of have to work with somebody who may be a little disagreeable. Al Simpson has this great line. He said, "I've been in this town a long time. You got to deal with guys that got bad breath and body odor." And he said, "They got dandruff falling off their shoulders. You have to just get beyond that and learn to work with it." And that's because that's where the country is.
Yeah. This is kind of jumping around. I don't have a linear mind. I'm actually losing my mind, I think. But in the preparation for the Vienna summit with Khrushchev was the occasion that President Kennedy was the man who accompanied Jackie Kennedy to Paris.
Right.
And I think it has to be observed that this glorious woman, young woman he married, was something far more significant in the world scene than eye candy. She was a foreign policy advantage, a card he played very well. But don't you agree?
Yeah, that was as close to royalty as we've had in my lifetime. The Reagans had their own form of it, but Jack and Jackie, when she arrived in Paris speaking perfect French, and she was 31 or maybe had turned 32 at that point. Think about that, how stunning that was. This beautiful woman who didn't overplay her role. It was pitch perfect in her kind of quiet confidence that she would demonstrate. And then you would have the black and white photographs of the two of them. And they could have been on the cover of any magazine and centerfold any time. Politics is a lot about symbolism.
But what does this say to the world, this incredible, vibrant, accomplished couple? What does it say about the United States
well, I
to
think
the
what
world?
it says is that, you have to remember this was right after World War II. We had just been the leading country in the Allied effort to bring down Nazi Germany. We were a colossus in our own way in the world because we had the only real economy that had survived. Japan's economy had been destroyed. A lot of Central Europe had been destroyed. The United States was this vibrant place. All those veterans had come back from the war, gone to college in record numbers, gave us new industry, gave us new art, gave us new science, got married in record numbers. So, the United States was on the move at that point. And to see this couple at the head of the American parade could not have been more fitting in its own way. The power of that symbolism is just hard to overstate when you go around the world. And the French, obviously, when they were in Paris, for somebody like Jack Kennedy and Jackie Kennedy, and then to have the president say, "I'm the man who accompanied Jackie Kennedy to Paris," he completely captivated them. And that's often the case when you have an American president come in. The rest of the world is always looking to us. What's going on in America? Who are these people? And we do have this wonderful combination of pure politics and the theater of politics that we put together in a way that other countries are not able to. And Jackie was dazzling, and she was a hugely important part as well of this invention of modern America. Up until then, we had first ladies who were very bright and committed. Eleanor Roosevelt know this, but they're always seen clutching their handbags with sensible little hats on.
Yeah.
You didn't see that anymore.
Yeah. History would go on and fill in some of the details that were not reported at the time about personal life and medical history. And this may be heresy to ask of a journalist. But do you think, Tom, that the world might have been better off and safer for none of that being brought out?
If what?
If none of the details of the president's medical history, for instance, medical condition, because today journalists would require, demand all. And I'm asking, was the world safer that we didn't know how ill our president was?
I doubt if he could have been elected if we'd known the full extent of his medical history. It was more far-ranging than anyone appreciated at the time. And when you read the accounts now, it's pretty astonishing. And it's especially astonishing that he looked as fit as he did, as much as he did when he was in public. And that was testimony to how carefully they managed it all. And then, of course, his other personal life, which everyone has read about and knows about now, and was part of it. That, not a scintilla of that could exist now. I've talked to a lot of the reporters who were around in those days, and I said, "How much did you know?" They said, "Well, we knew a little bit. We didn't know it was that much." Ben Bradley claims, who was one of his closest friends, that he didn't know about it at all, and that could very well have been the case. Although I keep saying, "Benji, are you sure?" So it was a different time. In the Roosevelt years, he had his own companion, and they ran practically a boarding house at the White House. With Harry Hopkins staying there and Churchill coming and staying for a couple of weeks. It was just a different time, and I would hope that we would get back to some measure of proportion in terms of our fascination and the importance of this. I do think medical records are important. I really do. Look, you had a case in Massachusetts of Paul Tsongas, who was running for president, doing very well, and he was dying of cancer at the time. And we didn't know the full extent of how ill he was. So this is a tricky issue. But President Kennedy had a lot of issues medically, a lot of them. I was just rereading some of the histories again, and it kind of takes your breath away, quite honestly.
The big picture, we're 50 years out. We always say, history will judge. Well, here we are.
Well, 50 years out, the fact that you and I are here talking about him at this library, you coming from Indiana, me coming from Yankton, South Carolina, that's pretty astonishing. That means that the American dream is really alive, folks.
And we are too.
Right, and we are too, right. I think that we are the product of our history. I believe that strongly, and it was reinforced, obviously, after I wrote The Greatest Generation. And I am a product of the Kennedy era. There's just no question about that. That helped imprint who I became, not just as a journalist, but as a citizen, and what my aspirations were professionally and also personally about how I wanted to live my life. Be adventurous. Have high energy. Don't be afraid to take something on in a way, because what you saw there, and then also surround yourself with the best and brightest. The best and brightest made some pretty critical errors later, but at the time, I was in college, and honest to God, I knew sub-cabinet secretaries because it was that exciting to know what was happening and who they were and where they came from. I remember Roswell Gilpatrick and Cy Vance was Secretary of the Army at the time. We knew who all these people were, and you were reading about them every night and watching the interplay that was going on. And they came, from our best institutions, and they had demonstrated real skills in other areas, and they were so young. My oldest daughter is older now than President Kennedy was when he was elected, and I just find that astonishing.
Yeah. But she's good looking too.
She'd be a very good president, by the way. But they were so young, and they had such energy, and most of all, they saw such possibilities for the country.
Tom, why did the best and the brightest choose government service?
Well, it was part of that generation's obligation. You got to remember that the war formed a lot of who they were. They'd all been in uniform, or they had been involved in the war effort in some fashion. And almost to a man and a woman, they came out of that experience saying, I am going to help take control of our destiny, our national destiny, and that means I'm going to go to Washington if necessary. Nick Katzenbach was a rising star, and he didn't know any of the Kennedys. He'd been a prisoner of war in World War II, and he was at that point, he was not teaching, he was in a law firm, and he was on a sabbatical in Switzerland. Life was very good. He came back here and crawled into the Kennedy administration. He tried to find a way. He fought his way into it. That's been lost. I say now to audiences where I go around the country, there was a time not so long ago when the very best lawyers in New York would be happy to take a job as the number 3 guy in the Commerce Department or in the Justice Department because they felt it's their obligation. They don't go there as a lifer. They come back after a while. This city has provided so much of that over the years. You find it in the younger ranks of our generations, but then they're not encouraged to stay. Or they find the environment when they get there too stultifying, too rigidly broken up into special interest or partisan lines. In those days, people went to Washington and wanted to be a part of it. And when the sun went down, they would get together, Republicans and Democrats alike, and have good times. And that's been lost. Now they run home, or they gather around each other. Here's a perfect example, just to tell you what the environment is like. 2 of them, actually. 2 years ago, I was in Washington, and 2 bright young men came up to me. Senator Kennedy, I guess it was 4 years ago, Senator Kennedy had sponsored something for the International Rescue Committee. These 2 bright young guys come up to me, typical young men who come from across the country to work in Washington. And they said, Mr. Brokaw, we want to ask you about the old days. And I think they met in 1996. And one of them said to me, I'm a Democrat. He's a Republican. He's my best friend. We go to Georgetown every night. We argue politics. His boss, a congressman, won't talk to my boss. But was it always like that? And I tried to walk him through that. I was telling the story to my friend Bob Schieffer from CBS, and Bob said, you're not going to believe what I'm going to tell you. He said, I had a very prominent Republican leader of the United States Senate coming on Face the Nation, and I had a Democrat as well, and the Republican leader's staff called and said, we don't want our guy to be in the same green room, which is a little preparation room you have off to the side, with the Democrat. Bob said, well, those are not the rules here. You come here, you play by our rules. But that's what's going on down there. And it was not in those days. They had very strong feelings. There were strong partisan lines, but they knew how to talk to each other. I mean, one of my very favorite memories of being a Washington correspondent is going to a State Department dinner one night when Nelson Rockefeller was the vice president and Hubert Humphrey had just come back to the Senate. And they embraced like fraternity brothers who had won the Yale-Harvard football game. I mean, they were just all over each other, laughing and comparing notes and going on and asking about family members. You don't see that anymore. You don't see that anymore. And during the Kennedy administration, there were all these exchanges that were going on because they had Doug Dillon in their cabinet, for example, as a prominent Republican, and they knew how to talk across party lines. In the early days, when they were both in the House, Jack Kennedy and Richard Nixon had a pretty good relationship. I find it very hard to imagine, but they did.
Tom, I've got some questions in my hand, and some of you have handwriting that is a lot like mine. So we'll go with the one I can read the best first. What similarities, if any, do you see between 1960 and 2011 with regard to the political climate?
Well, we have another young president, and we have an entirely new set of challenges, but they are, in their own way, transcendent challenges. We're coming through a very, very severe economic downturn. We have global competition that is different now, but it is profound. The difference between when we came out of the Reagan administration recession and this one is, in those days we didn't have China and India as powerful as they are now. So you can make the matchup, Russia, China, India, and what was beginning to happen in the Middle East. You've got a deeply, deeply divided Congress of the United States. That's one of the differences. There's a kind of, not just a polarization, but if you will, a calcification at the national level of these party lines, and they just are stuck where they are, and they're determined not to talk to each other. In those days, they still would work out each other. And every president learns, no matter how skillfully they have campaigned or how bright they may be and what kind of scores they had at the Harvard Law School, it's the toughest job in the world. You know, you hit the White House and think you're prepared for it, and then 24/7, all these problems come in all day long, every day. And now there is an accelerant out there, and it's the internet. People are pushing them around constantly on the internet, you know, and commenting on them, and that's one of the differences.
Yes. After President Kennedy's election, he issued a call to service with the nation's youth. They responded, coming to Washington, D.C., and things like the Peace Corps. We'll say my son Tom would have asked a similar question, asking why you think today's generation is so, notwithstanding the anger on the right, but basically the political passivity. Why then yes? Why now not?
Well, I'm actually writing about this, and I have a book coming out in the fall. And one of the pieces of it is that I am proposing, in a fairly significant way, the establishment of public service academies across America, and postgraduate work, but they don't have to be coming out of traditional institutions. You can have postgraduate work, for example, in third world construction and development in terms of housing, and making it a public-private partnership. You have a Johnson & Johnson Fellow in Third World Medicine, for example, a Caterpillar Fellow in Third World Agriculture, a GE Fellow in Third World Water Systems Development. And you work it out with the federal government and a sharing. There are some tax breaks both for the public servants and for the companies, and then they come back after 3 years, either from a domestic or an international assignment, and they go to work for those companies for 3 years, and they've got a whole skill set that they wouldn't have had otherwise. There's a longing to do public service. The apparatus is kind of run down at the hills at the moment, and no one is asking enough of them. Just very briefly, I will tell you that I have to leave tonight because I'm going off to Chicago, and I don't trust New England snowstorms in the morning. Bob Woodward and I have been pressing Oprah to do more about military families in America, and she has agreed to do a show, and we're going out to tape that with Mrs. Obama, because public service in America now is pretty much confined in terms of magnitude to the working class families who put on uniforms, less than 1% of our country, doing 100% of the fighting, and nothing is asked of the rest of us. And that's inappropriate in a democratic society.
And I see today that Veterans Affairs is on the proposed chopping block. I mean, something's got to go, but that did get my attention. Tom, what might be the one most memorable aspect of the JFK administration for you in the 60s and beyond, and the most lasting impact of his presidency?
Well, I think the can-do spirit, the sense of energy that he brought to the job, and the idea that he would be a magnet for people all over the country to come to Washington who would be inspired by his call to service, and that we can be more than the sum of our parts. And that's always the secret to this immigrant nation. And I was always struck by this dashing young man who could have been anything he wanted to be in life given the power and the wealth of his family, and he chose the public arena. And I am still in awe of that. And I've covered Bobby, and He didn't need to step back into the arena after he'd lost his brother in such a brutal fashion, and it had such an impact on him, but he did. And he told the truth on the campaign trail at a very difficult time. So this is something to remember, and to come to this institution is frankly a privilege for someone of my generation.
Why didn't you choose politics yourself? Yes, clap, clap. Yes. I'm sorry.
Well, I think
because you had been governor of
I was
South
governor
Dakota
of Boise State. That's as far as I got. As far as they'd want me to go. Jane was also governor of Girls State in Indiana, so that was the casting pool for the Today Show when we were on. I actually loved it and thought about it at one. I think that a lot of my friends, and when I was growing up in South Dakota, thought that I would probably get into politics. But I found journalism, and I think that journalism is a hugely important component of public service in America and public policy shaping. And I've worked very hard at trying to keep the right issues before the country. And I'm at a stage now where people have more tolerance for what I have to say. So I'm kind of an outrider, and I find it very gratifying. And when I go around the country, it's tough love. I say to audiences, 100 years from now, they're going to look back and they're going to judge this time not just by President Obama, but by all of us. Did we step up? Were we the next greatest generation? Did we measure up to what we, as baby boomers and those of us who are just a little bit older, promised the world that we could do? And if we take the full measure of where we are and where we need to go, I think there's work to be done. And so I have a certain amount of credibility based on my professional life, I guess, and I'm determined to spend it.
Well, you are, as a chronicler of your time, the greatest generation, and then boom, the story of my generation, the baby boomers. We're still basically around. We are going to be around for a long time. We're never going away. But demographers talk about something called the health expectancy. So we're not only going to live longer, but we're going to live longer, healthier. Why don't you charge my generation to attend those public service academies? Why don't we first build them, and why don't we become the first graduates? And why don't we spend the next 10, 20, 30 years of our lives answering the call to service that John Kennedy first issued when we were young?
Well, I don't put you in the service academies, but I do put you in public service because you have, at this stage in your life, real skills, real wisdom, and real experience. And so I do think that is a way to kickstart the baby boomer generation at the end. And you're going to have to stay in touch with the next generation because they're going to be paying for everything that you're going to be doing in Medicare and Social Security and everything else. Yeah, I do think that's a very important part of it, and I am writing about that in the next book. My book is more or less thematically a letter to my grandchildren. As my eldest daughter, Jane, knows, is an emergency room physician and takes no prisoners. She said, I don't want some sappy Hallmark card to my daughters about you wading through the snow to go to school and having to work. And so I said, no, it won't be that. It won't. But it is about the world that they're going to inherit and what the place is of the various generations along the way who are the beneficiaries of all that has gone before.
What was the last time you saw John Kennedy? You never met him.
I saw him at Strategic Air Command headquarters in Omaha, and later they would stop there from time to time, and I couldn't figure out why, but then I realized that planes in those days had to refuel more than they do now, so they were always stopping there, and he came out to inspect the headquarters. And it's not just the tricks of my memory, but he was almost a mythical figure out there in the flat sun of the Nebraska prairie, standing there, this dashing guy. He had a huge impact on wardrobes for people of my generation. We got rid of all of our button-down shirts because he didn't wear button-down shirts. The candidates came along afterwards. Gary Hart would get off an airplane and fix his tie the same way John Kennedy did, for example. And it was quite dazzling. About 3 weeks later, Bobby came, and it was on a day when George Wallace had said that President Kennedy should resign because of his policies on civil rights. And I'm the only reporter out there, and there's Bobby getting off the plane with those steel blue eyes, and he looked quite exhausted. I don't think he was real happy about having to deal with this 23-year-old reporter out in Omaha. And I asked, and I noticed, first of all, that his shirt was a little bit frayed. I told Meredith about that later, and she said, well, we should write to Ethel and tell her to do something about the wardrobe. Anyhow, I said, with all the bravado that I had, today the governor of Alabama, George Wallace, Mr. Attorney General, suggested that your brother resign the presidency because of the Civil Rights Act. Do you have any reaction to that? He looked at me for about 30 seconds, and I got to be about a millimeter tall by the time it was all done. And then he said to me, I have nothing to say about anything that the Alabama governor has to say, and turned and walked away. And I thought, I was simultaneously thrilled and terrified about what I had just gone.
Didn't he know who you were going to be? Do you know, I'm looking at the clock, because you've got to be on that plane.
One more question.
The day President Kennedy, the one and only time he ever came to South Dakota, was the happiest day of your life.
August 17th, 1962. The Yankton Press and Dakotan, of which there are still some copies around. Front page, President Kennedy visits South Dakota for the first time. Turn to the society pages. Tom, Brokaw, and Meredith all united in ceremonies at the Christ Episcopal Church. When I became a White House correspondent and came back to this library for the rededication of it and presided at it, the White House press came as well. And I made reference to that. And I said I would have invited the president to our reception, but in fact, I already knew about the habits of the White House press corps, and we couldn't afford to feed them or provide enough booze for them at the reception, so we're unable to. So that was our little connection to them. It's been a part of my life. I've come to know all the members of the family over the years, and I've had some grand times. And I walked in here tonight and realized the last time I was at the library was down in the atrium doing our coverage of the Teddy procession from here in Boston down to Arlington that went on for a long, long time, but it was a labor of love, and coming back and being reminded about the possibilities of this country in these institutions I think is really important to us.
Well, you're a great spokesman for your and every generation, Tom, and if you don't leave right now, you're not going to make that plane to appear on the Oprah show tomorrow, and we need you there. Would you all stay seated? Let's thank Tom for being here, and
thank you.
safe travels.